Okay, so now that we've got our column cut to length here, what we're going to do is we're going to lay out, and if you go back to figure 3 on page 45 of your packet, we're going to start laying out where the mortise is going to be in the column for our crossbeam. We figured out that the tenon on the crossbeam was 4 inches by 4 inches, 2 inches wide, okay? So we're going to lay out a mortise on here that is 2 inches wide, 4 inches tall. And then the depth will be 4 inches to accommodate for that tenon.
And actually, I don't know whether Steve had mentioned it earlier, is we're coming down from the top of where the column will run into the rafter 12 inches. And then we'll find the center point and whatnot and go from there. So again, taking a look at that sketch, we're coming down 12 inches to that crossbeam before we start looking at where we're laying out that mortise joint.
And on that sheet, we're going to come down, like Mr. Dorothy just said, 12 inches. Well, the bottom of our crossbeam will be at 18 inches. That's allowing for that 6-inch beam to come into our column here. So I'm going to mark both those lines so we can give you an example of what it's going to look like. This column is laying flat, and our crossbeam is going to come in and intersect our column, something like that. That's what it's going to look like when it's all done.
So there would be a tenon here entering into this pocket or mortise here.
And that's what I'm laying out. I'm laying out the mortise. So just for my reference, I want to know where the top and the bottom of that crossbeam are going to be. So now what I need to do is I need to find my center line. So I've got an exactly 6-inch wide beam here. Kind of lucked out because, as we said earlier, they can vary a little bit. So I'm going to mark 3-inch for my center line. And then I'm going to go ahead and just give myself a reference center line here. Okay. So we know that our tenon is going to be 2 inches wide, 4 inches tall. So we mark this for 6 inches. So what we're going to need to do is now we need to mark for the top and bottom of our tenon, which is coming in 1 inch, coming down 1 inch from the top of the crossbeam, coming up 1 inch from the bottom of the crossbeam. That's going to give us our 4-inch tall tenon. Then what we need to do is it needs to be 2 inches thick. So I'm going to lay out my tape just like this, and I'm going to mark 1 inch to the left and 1 inch to the right of my center line. Give me a 2-inch thick tenon. So then I'm going to take my straight edge and I'm going to take my straight edge again, my speed square. I'm going to mark top and bottom. So right here, what I'm going to put a big X through is our mortise. That's where we want our mortise. And it's going to be a 4-inch deep mortise, which we'll start by tracing it with a chisel. We're going to go after it with a drill and a Forstner bit, but we have to be mindful of the depth, and we need to make sure that we remain that 2-inch wide, 4-inch tall. So I'm going to start with a chisel.
So I'm gonna try to bring the camera over more directly to where Steve's actually working so you can actually see what he's marking. I notice you probably can't see the actual lines from that angle. So I'm gonna bring the camera over so that now you'll be able to directly see a little bit of what's gonna happen.
Okay, so like I said, here's our marked out mortise. This is mortise for the crossbeam. So what you always want to do is you want to trace this mortise with your chisel. You want to make sure you're going to put your chisel right on the line, and you're going to give it a couple taps with a mallet. And what this is going to do is this is going to give you a nice clean edge, and it gives you a definitive boundary that you need to follow.
You can actually see, or maybe not from your perspective, that that chisel has a beveled edge, and Steve is using the flat edge of it as the exterior of that pocket. So the flat portion of the chisel is up against the line. So I have a question. This is so within this meeting, you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions. If you look at the sidebar to the right, I'm sorry, if you're looking at your screen, it would be on the left-hand side. There's a location where you can type in a question. So I have a question to you. Let's see how quickly somebody can answer it. So Steve's laid this out. It's 4 inches across here. It's 2 inches in thickness. What's the depth that we're going to cut this mortise out? So while this continues, we'll continue on, but feel free to type in your response at this point.
So now what I need to do is, everyone should have answered that question already. And we're going down, the depth is 4 inches. And what I've got here is a Forstner bit on an extension, and it just so happens that the bottom cutting edge of the Forstner bit to this little line here on the extension is 4 inches. So I'm going to use this as a gauge. I'm not going to go all the way down. You got to be mindful not to go too deep. But I'm going to take the drill bit, and I'm going to make sure I don't exceed either outside edge. And I'm going to take the bulk of the material out with this. You have to be sure to clear the hole as you're going through, because if you don't, it's just going to bind up with all the shavings in there. So periodically you have to pull the bit back out. And while you're doing this, you need to make sure you're staying square. So what Mr. Dorothy's doing is just keeping an eye on making sure I'm not tipped one way or the other, so then that way you've got a nice square mortise. And now I'm going to repeat this process on this side to clear the bulk of the material out.
While he does that, I have another question that you can answer for us. What is the distance below where we're cutting to that is left for the material? So what's the remaining portion of this beam that is uncut? One of the things traditional framing had done in years past is not have the advancement of a drill of, a power drill anyways. A lot of times people would use like a hand boring kind of bit or hand drill, or they would chisel it all out completely. For those of you that have ever used like a hole saw, a hole saw is used to cut like a circular hole in various material. This is very similar to it, called a Forstner bit, but it's also very aggressive. The size of these chips coming up very large. You can kind of see that. When you see that, that's what I would call an aggressive bit. That is pulling down into the wood. It's not an easy task, as much as Steve makes it look easy here.
And because of the, like we mentioned earlier, the timber is so green, and there's so much moisture in here, that's why the bits have a tendency to bind and catch. So if you see the drill stops every so often, I either have to put it in reverse, take it back out. It's just because it is so green, and you can see that the wood's really stringy, so it's just making it a little difficult to drill through.
At this point, we're going to continue with a little bit of chiseling. I'll let Steve get started, and then I'll probably stop the video. You won't notice the pause per se, but he'll just kind of talk a little bit for the next few minutes on chiseling this out, and then we'll pause, so when we come back, you'll see that we have gone a lot further ahead.
So when you're going to do a mortise with a chisel, you don't want to take too much material at one time. You want to, you know, like I'm going to come here where the two bits met. I'm not going to come all the way back here and try and take that in one shot. It's going to be too difficult, and you actually run the risk of damaging the chisel, either bending the chisel or breaking the sharpened end off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly take bits and pieces and work my way out to the line. And I'm going to use the bevel of this chisel as my depth control on what I'm taking. So when you're using a chisel, say for example when I line this out, I put the flat side of the chisel to the outside edge, okay? Well, the difference here is, depending on how I tip this chisel with that bevel, depends on how much material it's gonna take. So you're gonna see the chisel kind of working back and forth a little bit, controlling how much material gets taken out in one shot.
So as Steve is doing this work, whether you know this or not, Steve's actually very much into various tools associated with woodworking. So how old, Steve, is this particular chisel that you have?
This chisel is 50 to 75 years old.
So old tools still have a life left in them. Steve spent a lot of time, we're contemplating whether we want to show you him sharpening the chisel, depending on time frame, but he's taken some time to hone and sharpen that chisel, so it's very sharp.
Not a lot of effort is needed, especially when you have a good sharp chisel. So some of the bulk material you'll see will be taken out with a mallet, driving the chisel, but for the most part, especially on these edges, good sharp chisel just allows you to take it right off by hand. Sharp tools make the work far easier. As for the corners, it's a little bit different of a story. So they do have chisels. There are chisels that are made that are 90 degrees, so it's two chisel blades. Or you can dive in here and just take little bits off of each side. You just slowly work through that mortise corner. Again, being conscious to not take too much material at one time. You don't want to drive the chisel in so far that you can't get it back out, and you definitely don't want to damage your tools.
So while we're working on this particular column here, there's another group of students that are working on another set of columns over there. You don't see them in the picture right now. And they're trying to get the second side of this built for us. And that's actually a joke, because there's nobody over there. It's going to be just Steve and I doing this. I'm going to pause this now and then let Steve kind of catch up so that we'll go a little further ahead without you just sitting there watching us do this. So we'll be right back.